Ephesus, Turkey's premier archaeological site, was one of the most important cities in the classical world. Famous for its great temple of Artemis, it became the capital of the Roman province of Asia and had as many as 250,000 inhabitants. Although only about 5% of the city has been excavated, this fraction contains some of the most spectacular ruins anywhere. Ephesus was founded on a sheltered natural harbor where the river Cayster flowed into a bay of the Aegean. That harbor was directly in front of us. Originally, the coast was not far from the theater where we're now sitting, but over the centuries, as silt filled the harbor, it receded toward the horizon. By the Roman period, the harbor basin was in the distance, at the end of that avenue. Today, the sea is miles away. As we see it today, Ephesus was founded by Lysimachus, a general of Alexander the Great, at the beginning of the 4th century BC. Though the city was already centuries old, Lysimachus moved the inhabitants here to a planned settlement with neatly gridded streets and a vast new wall. Although some of the most prominent buildings in Ephesus, including this theater, were begun in the Hellenistic era, almost everything now visible dates to the Roman imperial period. The theater, partially restored in the 20th century, was one of the largest in the classical world, with seats for 24,000 spectators. The stage building has mostly vanished. When it was intact, this was an elaborate marble screen, decorated with dozens of statues. This monumental avenue, which connected the harbor with the city center, was laid out during the 2nd century on reclaimed land. We see it now in its late antique incarnation, when it was called the Arcadianae, after a son of Theodosius I. By that period, the street was lit at night. Ephesus had several agoras, of which 2 have been excavated. Variously called the Lower or Tetragonos Agora, this space appears to have been set aside for commerce. Behind the 2-story stoas that ringed this space were a series of shops and storerooms. At the center was a circular horologium, a monumental sundial and water clock. Like the Arcadianae, this form was rebuilt in late antiquity after an earthquake, and most of the columns are reused from other buildings. We're now approaching the most iconic space in Ephesus, the Triodos, so called because 3 major thoroughfares met there. On the right is the reconstructed gate of Mesias and Mithridates, which led into the Lower Agora. Built in the reign of Augustus by 2 imperial freedmen, its dedicatory inscription was written out in letters of bronze, in both Greek and Latin. Originally, the gate was flanked by towers, which likely held the tombs of the dedicators. Ahead of us is the famous library of Celsus. Tiberius Julius Celsus Polemianus was a distinguished Roman official who held a series of important offices, commanding a legion, elevated to the rank of consul, and finally serving as governor of the province of Asia. Celsus seems to have retired to Ephesus, and after he died in the reign of Trajan, his son presided over the building of this library, which doubled as Celsus's tomb. The facade, destroyed by a medieval earthquake, was re-erected in the 1970s. As you can see, it was impressively elaborate. The columns are of Phrygian marble, shipped from the interior of Asia Minor. The 4 statues in the 1st story, these are replicas, represent the virtues of Celsus: Sophia, wisdom; Arete, nobility; Ennoia, good judgment; and Episteme, knowledge. Equestrian statues of Celsus flanked the stairs. Fasces, symbols of Celsus's consular rank, are worked into the rich decoration of the door frame. Inside the library, books were arranged on 3 levels. The usual estimate is that the building held around 10,000 scrolls, stored in cabinets along the walls. Celsus himself was buried in a sarcophagus beneath the apse, a signal honor, since burial was usually forbidden within the city limits. His bones remain there still. From the Triodos, we turn to the most important street in Ephesus, the Embolos, also known as the Street of the Curetes. The street connects the upper and lower agoras, following the natural valley between Mount Pion and Mount Coressus. Paved with marble, it was lined with colonnades and a series of imposing monuments. Here at the base of the Embolos were a number of monumental tombs, including one for Arsinoe, the youngest sister of Cleopatra, who was murdered at Ephesus in 41 BC. I'm standing on the steps of Arsinoe's tomb. Across the street are a reconstructed latrine and a structure described, probably incorrectly, as a brothel. Beside them are the Baths of Varius, which date to the 2nd century, but were restored by a Christian lady named Scholastica more than 200 years later, using materials taken from other public buildings. The so-called terrace houses, partly covered by this protective structure, were occupied from the 1st to the 7th centuries, with some interruptions. 2 full blocks, each containing about a half dozen living units, have been uncovered. The living units, centered on courtyards, were luxurious and richly decorated. Over time, some were converted to non-residential purposes, ranging from banquet hall to Christian chapel. Across the street from the terrace houses, and at the very heart of the tourist maelstrom, is another famous building, the so-called Temple of Hadrian. This structure may not have been dedicated to Hadrian. It was rebuilt after an earthquake in late antiquity, and its stones may have come from another monument. But since its reconstruction in the 1950s, this has been one of the symbols of Ephesus. The facade is certainly striking, with that arcuated lintel and lushly carved decoration. The 4 statue bases in front of the temple carried statues of the tetrarchs, Diocletian and his co-emperors, who ruled at the turn of the 4th century. Here we have the partially reconstructed Nymphaeum of Trajan, a monumental fountain with a 2-story facade, erected in the early 2nd century. A gallery of statues filled its niches, splashed with light reflecting from the fountain's basin. Now, at last, we come to the upper or state agora, the civil heart of Ephesus. Let's go left to right. This side of the upper agora was dominated by the 2-story Basilica Stoa, a multi-purpose structure with judicial and official functions. It was built during the reign of Augustus and featured colossal statues of the first emperor and his wife Livia. Behind this building, just ahead of us, was the Prytaneon, a courtyard-centered structure used by civic officials, which featured facilities for public banquets. It was here the city's hearth, sacred to Hestia, burned day and night. Next to the Prytaneon, to the left of that theater-like structure, was the Temenos, a sacred area likely connected with the imperial cult. Beside it was the Bouleuterion, and that is the theater-like structure. It was here that the Boule, the city council, met. Since it had about 1,500 seats, it likely also served as an odeon, used for rhetorical performances. It dates to the 2nd century. Beyond that was a 2nd century bath complex, still only partly excavated. We're more familiar with a temple that stood on the platform that dominates the western end of the agora. This was a sanctuary dedicated to Domitian. After that emperor was assassinated and his memory condemned, it was hastily rededicated to Vespasian, Domitian's father. We'll conclude with the Gate of Hercules, named for these reliefs of the hero. Though it uses stone from older structures, the gate likely dates to the late 5th century. By the time it was built, the Western Roman Empire was already gone. Little more than a century after, Ephesus itself would fall into terminal decline. The people drifted away and debris covered the city. Much of it, as we've seen, remains buried. But the fragments that have been uncovered evoke, with a vividness rivaled only by Pompeii, the life and death of a great ancient city.